Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, January 9th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
Obviously, the story of the day, the week, the month are the wildfires that are consuming parts of Los Angeles. This story is getting worse, not better. Every couple of hours, a new fire breaks out in a different location, either carried by embers that are the Santa Ana winds are blowing miles in other directions and starting fires far to the east of where they originally started, or unconfirmed reports that there are people starting fires in some places, including the Hollywood Hills, just to see what might happen, which is so horrifying that I can hardly even take it in. I think it's almost immediately a giant political story, and there are two reasons for that. One is that the candidate for mayor in 2022, the two candidates for mayor in 2022, Rick Caruso and Karen Bass, are now playing central roles again. Karen Bass as the mayor, who was in Ghana at a conference when the fires broke out, and Rick Caruso as a developer and an owner of a mall in the Pacific Palisades that he managed to save, but he was the first voice in the story saying that the fire hydrants in Los Angeles were apparently empty. And so we have a kind of return to the fight between Karen Bass and Caruso. Karen Bass, a standard issue progressive Democrat, and Caruso, a kind of Bloombergian, non-ideological, get things done guy who almost made it into the mayoralty, but was prevented in the 11th hour by a real rally by public sector workers who turned out at the polls in colossal numbers. That's number one. Number two is that throughout the Trump administration, Donald Trump, oddly, it always seemed to me, and purposelessly almost, was kind of obsessed with the question of California's fire management and talked about it a lot. I mean, in ways that often, as he does, seem kind of like off the topic, or he had some friend who was, as my grandmother would say, hawking him a Chinik about it. And yet here we are in the beginning of his new administration. And some of the things that he talked about, which aren't really germane necessarily to this fire, because a lot of it had to do with forest management and how California was leaving things on the ground instead of burning them up or whatever. But nonetheless, he spoke about the different.
He also talked about access to water. Actually,
right
in California quite extensively, and how it was,
and that water was being run into the ocean in order to divert it from places for ecological reasons, or for conservationist reasons, or for reasons having to do with supposedly endangered species. So whether or not it was all that germane, it's kind of eerie that this topic that seemed to consume him and not all that many other people has now come to the forefront of American politics just as he is taking office. And so the promise that Trump will be a new kind of politician with new kinds of solutions to new kinds of problems is now right in front of us. We're not talking now about Iran. We're talking about California. We're talking about, a situation in which tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of damage are going to be registered in one of the bluest areas in the country.
Right. And, Trump also made it political by issuing a statement criticizing Governor Newsom for the actions that you mentioned, specifically this water bill. And it's hard to talk about politics at a time when people are still trying to save their homes and the firefighters are combating the inferno. I think at the time of recording today, some 5 people have lost their lives. And of course, just the incredible property damage too is just hard to comprehend. But it's going to be a political issue. Natural disasters are almost always political. Um, when you look at how, say, Democrats and liberals critique hurricane management when it occurs under either Republican governors or Republican presidents, as was the case with Katrina, you see that what Trump is doing in his inimitable way is sadly par for the course when it comes to these types of events. At the same time, I do think that there are legitimate questions to be asked. You mentioned that Karen Bass is kind of a standard issue Democrat, and she's actually pretty far left. She's kind of run away from her far left background in the heat of a surprisingly kind of contested race with Caruso a couple years ago. But she is a far left Democrat. There's no question about it. Newsom is a progressive left winger, and when you think about similar blazes that occurred in Canada, just what was it 1 year ago that 2 years ago now that were darkening the skies of Manhattan. This central question of forest management, how you deal with the brush. Do you actually engage in controlled burns in order to deprive these fires of fuel, or do you say, well, because we're all good greens here, we're not going to do anything to disturb the natural forest. We're just going to let the forest grow naturally and not touch it. That has real life consequences, as we saw in Canada, and now as we're seeing play out in Southern California.
There's also beyond just the tragedy of the 5 deaths that we know of, and unfortunately there probably will be more discovered, and the property loss, and there's just the general fear and anxiety that the people who live in Los Angeles right now are experiencing, not knowing. This also strikes me as an example, it's political for a reason. And that's because there was a complete breakdown of communication between local emergency organizations, whether that was the fire department or the LA Police Department or the mayor's office, and the people who were desperate to know. They would get evacuation orders, they would leave, they would evacuate to another place, then that place was evacuated. So they're in the entire time they're wondering, will I return to an ash heap or a home that's still standing? They were getting no information for about 12 hours that first night. There were no updates on the fire department's page about anything going on. And as images of buildings and entire shopping areas were shown burning to the ground, it listed 0 structures destroyed. So that is unconscionable in an era where we're supposedly able to have instantaneous news, lots of feedback. All of these platforms that, are praised for their information sharing purposes broke down, but they broke down because the government agencies at the local level were not providing information. So that communication breakdown then leads people to ask, what's going on? Why isn't the government doing what it should do? And then you see, the politicization happens because the functional, the one functional thing a local and state government is supposed to do is protect and inform its citizens. And it immediately broke down in the wake of an emergency. And it's the one time where citizens are expected to be able to rely on water being in the hydrants, information being shared with them. And it didn't happen here.
And to the functional question, Karen Bass went to Ghana despite having received increased warnings about high winds and potential for fire. And when she came back, she was faced with questions. Should you have gone to Ghana? Do you want to apologize to the people of Los Angeles? And she stood there stone-faced and looked at the ground. She didn't answer. So
for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So for 2 minutes. I mean, the video is quite startling. Her literal refusal to engage. And look, we understand these are highly complex issues. Part of the issue with California is that, glorious though it is, and it is topographically, environmentally, all of that, the most beautiful state you could possibly imagine. There are real issues with it being a place where 38 million people live. It's pretty wild, even though it's all developed. And, of course, we know
the four seasons are mudslide, earthquake, fire, and drought. Those are the 4
right.
seasons in California, right?
Right. And so obviously California goes through these times far more than a lot of other states, except for like the shoreline states like Florida and others. because God did not entirely mean it to be the most populous place in the United States, and so that requires a greater degree of care and concern about managing the physical environment of the state. And this is clearly a matter of almost no interest to the politicians who have taken charge and have been running California for the last 20
Well,
years. That is to
I
say, they're much more interested in talking about global climate change than they are in trying to prevent the next ecological disaster. They
yeah,
they
I
want to
mean
go to climate change. Yeah,
their interest in the environment is anti-human. So take the water, for example, right? Some of the water issues derive from the Endangered Species Act and the efforts to protect, smelts and small fish um, that have real life consequences in the ability of the state to distribute water. And this is, I think, what Trump was partly referring to when he talked about these issues on the campaign trail and also in his interview with Joe Rogan. Think about how the anti-developmental mentality, right, not only affects the housing supply in California, making housing ridiculously expensive, but it also creates issues in terms of, say, evacuating from Malibu, where you have one way in and one way out, and Malibu is essentially this rural preserve of the ultra rich that is nevertheless exposed to the elements. So I think John's right in saying that California does have these kind of environmental characteristics that make it possibly hazardous to human habitation. But that only means that public policy should be oriented toward, well, how do we preserve the humans? How do we allow humans to grow safely here, rather than, oh, let's not touch the environment because humans are somehow a spoliation of the environment, and that will only lead, I think, as it has, to bad consequences.
I mean that is a very deep point. And let's talk about California's political history over the last 2 decades has been weirdly instructive, because, as Christine says, there are these 4 natural disaster seasons, and then there are mismanagement problems. Gray Davis, the governor of California, in the beginning of the 21st century, was driven from office because the electrical grid failed, and people were living with these controlled. What were they called? Grayouts. They have to
Rolling
shut off the power,
blackouts. Yeah.
rolling blackouts, all this because they had mismanaged the electrical grid in California, had not taken sufficient care of it. And that brought Arnold Schwarzenegger to the governor's mansion, where he served for 8 years. And then whatever ideological nonconformity he showed was quickly sort of put in the rearview mirror by a return to just straight on progressive Democratic Party rule in the form of Gavin Newsom, and then of course the state legislature and the people who got elected there, so you have electrical problems, you have environmental problems, you have forestry problems, you have, as Matt says, this kind of weird thing where you have 40 million people crammed into a state that is less concerned with making it livable than it is with some of these more abstract ideas about how to.
Well, and we should add the policy choices regarding homeowners insurance, that the state of California caps on homeowners insurance value, things that were happening before the fires, that were a response to insurance industry issues that California was quite draconian about, and that now the residents who've lost their homes in fires are unfortunately going to be literally paying the price for.
That is a key point, because so there we're talking about Trump and populism, and there's a lot of conversation about populism and all of that. And there is a form of left-wing populism that the Biden administration hews to, and that obviously Gavin Newsom and the California legislature hew to, which is uh, people are getting screwed by giant companies, and so the giant companies need to be constrained by top-down legislation that does things like cap prices of drugs and controls prices of pharmaceuticals, and in this case says caps the cost of insurance policies. So what happens in such circumstances? Insurers decide that it is not worth the risk to insure in California, and people had great trouble once they capped insurance rates getting appropriate fire insurance. And this is why this story, we're only at the very beginning of what could be a political apocalypse in the United States because of policy choices made by elected politicians who are going to have to answer for the consequences that seem now to be relatively direct. Like, you have a $5 million house, so you're a wealthy person, granted. Okay, but you have a $5 million house, and you were unable to get proper levels of fire insurance for it. It burns to the ground. You're going to get $1 million back in value on a $5 million house, and you are thrown into penury as a result.
All of it speaks to a larger blue crisis, I think, which is that the great irony here is that you have California, which is a state that arguably, because of the natural disasters, because it is so topologically diverse and populated, requires more than any other state the most basic, concrete functioning of governments, right? Like to keep people safe, to keep things running in spite of conditions and so on. And at the same time, you have a governing ideology for a long time that is focused on abstractions, right? Having to do with modern liberalism. The gap between doing the basic job of governance, especially in a state like California, and the things that they're up to, in terms of social programs and whatever else, all the ideas that move
DEI,
east
right?
from
I
there.
mean, we had
DEI,
the
everything else.
fire department, the
Yes.
LA fire department was what the rules of how to become an LA firefighter were changed in order to de-emphasize white male physical strength in favor of a more diverse firefighting workforce. Now, we have no reason yet to question that the firefighters themselves have done anything but heroic
No, but
work
the
in this
money spent
regard.
on those policy
Right.
choices matters, because that's
Right.
money not spent on training and recruiting and keeping at their peak performance
Right.
the equipment and the firefighters themselves.
Look,
Well,
I think catastrophe exposes one, human weakness. We are powerless ultimately against nature. But two, it also tests leadership, the metal of leadership. And so what we're seeing right now in California, tragically, is political leadership that really doesn't know what to do because it's so consumed by virtue signaling and placating the various public, private interests, special interests that govern the state. So, yeah, I mean, California's problem is ultimately liberalism, and that's why people are driving away from California, have been doing so for a decade now, and I think are likely to actually accelerate that move to other places, primarily red states, in the aftermath of the inferno. But you have to contrast that with, on the one hand, say Governor DeSantis, right? So there, the power of nature is on display with hurricanes. DeSantis has, I think, exhibited great leadership, command, but also an ability to reconstruct and rebuild very quickly. I'd also point to Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania. I mean, look, he's a liberal Democrat. He's a partisan. But when that piece of 95 collapsed, he said, look, we're going to build it right away. And they did. They got a solution up very quickly. I don't know if Newsom And I seriously doubt Karen Bass's capacity to do something similar. And just one other maybe point of comparison is Los Angeles, though we don't think of it this way, could end up being something like New Orleans after Katrina, where the disaster happened. Of course, Bush received the blame for Katrina, even though much of the decisions on the ground that led it to be such an incredible human tragedy were made by the Democratic political leadership in Baton Rouge and in New Orleans. Remember Mayor Nagin, for example? Well, even though at the time everyone was going about Bush, beneath the surface in the politics of New Orleans, huge things were happening. One, a lot of the city left. They went to Houston. And two, the political kind of fault lines were exposed to such a degree that you had a period of revolt against the leadership in New Orleans, but also statewide. And now we have a transition where Louisiana is essentially a red state, and you got a MAGA governor,
it had a Democratic governor in 2005.
Right now, it's purely red. So
Bianco,
look, I'm not saying the same thing's going to happen in California in 2 years, but we did see in the previous election that California is drifting right, and I would say that the way that this crisis was magnified by public policy choices. You can't control the Santa Ana winds, right? But you can make public policy choices that make it easier to combat them when fire breaks out. That, I think, will become a political issue, and it will be an issue that does not benefit the liberal left-wing leadership of California and Los Angeles.
One of the deepest, earliest examples of what we might call neoconservative thinking came from Nathan Glazer, who was one of the assistant editors on Commentary when Commentary was founded in 1945, and then, of course, was the co-editor of the Public Interest, the foundational neoconservative social science and government policy quarterly that came into being in the 1960s. And Nat said that the crisis in urban governance, because that was his subject, was urban policy, came about when city leaders or city governments stopped doing what they knew how to do, which was collect the garbage, control crime on the streets. Those were really the two major examples. Shovel the snow. And tried to start doing things that nobody knew how to do, like eliminate poverty, alleviate joblessness. These were not jobs that a mayor or a city council could handle, but concrete, discrete acts of government action for which government exists, public safety, public order, and the management of the infrastructure of a city or state or something like that. That's what government is there for at root. And if you have Gavin Newsom, who was on with Anderson Cooper last night on CNN, standing in the midst of a fire, and Anderson Cooper said, Donald Trump attacked you. What do you have to say to Donald Trump and his attacks? And Gavin Newsom whined. He was like, I don't know why we're having this kind of thing when people are suffering and dying. And, I today was with a man who knows how to be a leader for all the people. And that was Joe Biden, because Joe Biden was in LA because his granddaughter was having a baby. And what did he do? He went to the hospital. He saw his granddaughter's baby. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, okay. But this is a perfect example, because this is what has happened. And there's a version of it on the right, but you see it very much so in the Democratic Party, which used to be full of public servants, right? Public and service were the two words you'd hear when someone ran for office. Now it's performative publicity when they come out and talk. It's not, there's no service aspect to it either. The reason he talks about how he feels is that he's rewarded for that by his voters. He's rewarded by being, you know, a celebrity kind of politician. He's incredibly vain. And what did Joe Biden's visit mean? It meant that the residents who had evacuated their homes were still under a news blackout because the news helicopters and other media stuff were all grounded while Biden was in the area. It actually made things more difficult from a strategic and logistical standpoint. But that inability to understand one's role as a public servant and to absolutely turn their back on the service aspect of that, because they've become a kind of celebrity and they're rewarded for that. They do it because it works. I mean, that's, and maybe
but
that
this
is
didn't work.
I have a
work
question.
anymore.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did we find out whether the great grandchild is a boy or
Male
a girl?
or female? Hey,
Because
no, they were assigned
Biden
didn't
wasn't
know.
clear on that.
It's up to the
So
child.
what Biden said, just to if you didn't hear it, was he said it's a terrible tragedy here in Los Angeles. On the plus side, I have a great grandchild now, which is really that talk about great communing with the suffering of a city that is burning down. I'm sure we're all very happy that Naomi Biden Neal had a baby, and congratulations to her, and that it's wonderful that he has a great grandchild. That was an unnecessary little addendum for the American people to have to listen to. And yes, he said she had a baby boy, a baby girl, and I actually don't know what it was,
but it was already pardoned.
Okay, but my point here is.
Oh wait, I'm sorry, I just got that.
Yeah,
that is good.
Yeah, that is good. That is good. And who knows what's going to happen next? But I think it's striking. You're saying that Newsom is rewarded for his performative. That was the sight of.
Change. Maybe that will change. I hope it will
I'm
change.
saying the sight of him last night was the sight of somebody whose life ambition has, and I hate to use this because it sounds, but has gone up in smoke. The expression on his face was somebody whose deepest desire, which is that he will be the president come 2029, will not happen now. I mean, granted, maybe I'm overreading. It's only 48 hours.
Is he going to, after the winds abate and the fire is contained, which is not today as we're recording this, but is he going to lift all the environmental protections and lift all the restrictions in order that Los Angeles in these communities can rebuild? That will be the test. Is he going to say, look, we experienced as a community this incredible catastrophe, but it's up to us to do everything to bring back Los Angeles better than ever, in particular, in light of the fact that the Olympics are coming to Los Angeles in 2028. Is he going to do that? That will be the test. And if he can't do that because he's imprisoned by his ideology, which is what I suspect, then I think you're right. It's going to be a huge political liability. And that's part of the collateral damage of
By the way, the
situation
other
like
thing
this.
is the stone-facedness and the muteness of Karen Bass as she stood in the airport being asked this question. Again, very striking contrast to good examples of crisis management by politicians in the face of disaster. And I want to keep being, like a DeSantis PR person, but
no,
DeSantis,
you should, because he is
right.
so, I'm sorry.
But what does he do? Yes.
When he appears after, I was in Florida after both of the most recent hurricanes, like in one case, not that, like less than a week after everything. And already you could see at both the county level, the state level, at every level, he was communicating. It was a very organized effort. And yes, there were things that come up here and there, but they have a team in place that is ready to go when the minute a tropical storm starts to form. And that is how you go.
Right. That's one thing. The other thing is that he stands in front of a microphone. He says, okay, here's what we're going to do, or here is what is happening, and here is what we're going to do. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And Gavin Newsom is like, Donald Trump is being mean to me. That's a very
he's finding his camera angle, and then he's saying Donald Trump is mean to me.
nobody cares about Gavin Newsom right now. Nobody in LA or in California cares about Gavin Newsom's emotional state. What they would like is a sense of somebody saying, yeah, here's what we're going to do. Planes are going to try to, we're doing what we can to get the planes with the water to drop the water on the fires. We cannot expect the LA fire department to put out a fire of this magnitude. We're going to have to do this and that. We are setting out the National Guard to help with the evacuations. I mean, I don't know what the steps are, because I'm not the governor of California for however long he's been governor of California. And I haven't lived in a state that has faced numerous statewide infrastructure crises for more than 2-3 decades. You would think, because that's the case in Florida, that beginning with Hurricane Andrew in 1992, the entire way that Florida dealt with natural disasters was flipped on its head. And everybody said, we can't go through what we went through in 1992. We need to change building codes. We need to do this. We need to have an emergency management thing in place that meets every week. You would think that the same thing would have happened in California after earthquakes, bridge collapse.
John, they can't count ballots within a month.
No,
it takes them 6 weeks to determine who won congressional races in California.
This is actually an example where the ideology of climate change stuff in particular comes into play. Building codes were completely rehabbed in California because of earthquakes after the big earthquake in the 1980s, particularly Northern California. If you know anyone who's an architect or a developer,
right,
the way they do the retrofitting that was required, I mean, and it did involve a lot of regulation and whatnot, but they have made California not earthquake proof, but much, much safer. And that was done, I think, in part because you can't blame earthquakes on climate change. Every other disaster that strikes California, you can point to this existential risk and say, well, it's out of our hands unless you stop flying on airplanes and eat less meat. And that is a problem.
But you can blame earthquakes.
Being hyperbolic.
You can blame earthquakes on fracking, which is why California limits its energy production when it could be so much more beneficial to world energy markets. That the environmental mentality there applies as well. I mean, there's a tendency on the right to blame illegal immigration for most of California's problems, and I seriously disagree with this. The root of California's problems is Hollywood, San Francisco liberalism, which has been regnant there since the 1980s. And over 2 generations has wrecked the most beautiful state in the country. And it's very sad to see this play out in real time. And you have to think that there are going to be downstream consequences of this.
I think, and again, getting back to sort of the fact that this is happening just as Donald Trump is coming into office, it provides him, maybe it's heartless to talk this way, and I apologize for doing so, if it seems like I am not paying sufficient attention to the tragedy, but it provides him with a contrast inside the United States. It's not just Biden who is the failure that he was elected to somehow supplant and reverse policies of. It is the model of what Walter Russell Mead has called blue state governance, right? Which is implicated in the treatment in the border crisis.
Well, and what's his opponent's whole identity? Kamala Harris is a California politician.
Right.
She's a California Democrat through and through.
Right. And so I think that he can say the way these people have gone about professing their ideology and putting their ideology into practice in terms of state legislation and regulation and things like that, we can now say are actively harmful, not only to the economy in the form of, as Matt would say, like the fact that the fracking is limited, that our economic, the engine of our economic power in energy is, we have to fight to get the stuff out of the ground that has these massive
energy and defense were the 2 pillars of red California.
Right. They
and
were.
The liberals,
right.
And the liberals destroyed both of them.
Yes.
Right. And now it's blue California. So we want red California back. We got to go. We have to return to the economic basis of that.
Yeah, I mean, people may not really know this because it was 30 years ago, and if you're a younger person, you may not know this, but California was a Republican state.
Two
Not
great
just
Republican presidents,
yeah,
Reagan and Nixon,
yeah. But I
come
mean,
from California.
it was a Republican state, and as Matt said, that in part was driven by the creation of the modern defense industry, which much of which was centered in California, shipbuilding, nuclear
Aeronautics,
aeronautics, and
energy, oil,
oil, and so you have this change in politics with the end of the Cold War and the creation of the peace dividend, which was the massive reduction in defense spending. You had the defense industry in Southern California not ended, but I mean essentially kind of no longer being this dominating force in the California economy, and then. Yeah,
right.
and
so
then
those two bases were replaced by Silicon Valley, right?
Right.
And the thing about Silicon Valley is that it has waxed and waned from right to left. Silicon Valley in the 90s was more libertarian, more associated with the right. But then, because of a reaction to Bush, it swung far left, and that too influenced the political character of the state. You have trillions in market capitalization based in Northern California, and it also money can make consequences softer for a lot of people, right? But what we've seen in the past year is that Silicon Valley, important parts of it, are moving back to the right, and that could have again a significant effect in the politics of the state.
Well, because
it'd be good if Elon Musk would maybe focus his attention on California politics for a little bit, rather than getting the AfD in power in Germany.
Well, that's a very, just to take a sort of side note. So Elon Musk, a Californian, had this idea for a project, right, which was using this new technology that he had helped create, the Boring Company, to create new pathways in Los Angeles to the airport through tunneling, private sector tunneling, right, which has almost never been done, at least as an infrastructure matter. And of course, this became wildly controversial. And the idea was he was going to upset the San Andreas Fault. I don't know. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff in relation to it. And I think part of his move to the right over time had to do with coming face to face with and dealing with the consequences of being an active person trying to innovate in a state that you can innovate in Silicon Valley as long as what you're doing is on an infinitesimal scale with a tiny little silicon chip.
And the liberals ran him out of California.
They ran him out of California.
He went to Texas now.
Right. And to Las Vegas, where we learned this week the Boring Company is digging tunnels around Las Vegas, which is also a much less regulated place. And I think your largest point, which I think is very telling, is in the wake of disasters. So Shapiro being a very good example of this, you have to relax ordinary policies to clear away red tape and clear the brush. Sorry, again, maybe not an appropriate term to use here.
Your metaphors today are very timely.
Are very, very timely, unfortunately, tastelessly timely. But in order to make it possible to bring things back as fast as possible, and to restore normalcy, and to allow people to rebuild homes, because it starts getting, when you have thousands of homes destroyed in California, the cost of lumber and bricks and things like that to rebuild those houses, just like in New York is going to be staggering. After Hurricane Sandy, reconstruction costs on the East Coast became insanely unaffordable because of
people out of their homes for months and months, sometimes years at a time.
Listen, Pali High, one of the major high schools in Los Angeles, burned to the ground yesterday. We have friends who have kids who go to Pali High. They have no idea where their kids are going to go to school. It's January. 5 schools probably hosting or housing 25,000 kids have burned to the ground. What happens now? You're not even talking about housing now. We're talking about people whose houses haven't burned down, who have children who have nowhere to go to school. Now, granted, liberals don't care about school anymore. They're happy to let kids stay at home and go crazy and have nervous breakdowns on Zoom. So, good. Congratulations. We're going to now go back into this for California students who already have suffered learning loss and psychological torment from being isolated in their homes on a screen. Well, I guess we're going back to that.
I think we should spend a little bit more time on Trump, having talked about problems with liberalism. Trump will be president in 11 days, and so he is going to inherit this disaster and the recovery.
And he complained about it, by the way, on Truth Social yesterday.
I'm sure he did.
Thanks a lot, Gavin Newsom.
Right.
You left this in my. Ceded this to me, or Biden.
What this 24 hours have reminded me is that the whirlwind is coming. The Trump whirlwind is coming back to Washington, and what you get out of the whirlwind is often some commonsensical points. You often get a demand for action that, in my view, is often in the right direction, public policy wise. But you also get a mess, and you also get a lot of personal attacks, ad hominem attacks, loyalty tests. You get a lot of confusion and ambivalence, right? And all of this is kind of swirls together. And so, Trump is making, I think, correct arguments about California's mismanagement. He does it in his way that connects with a lot of people, but also sparks, his opponents to say, "Oh, why are you calling him Governor Newsom? What are you?" And at the same time, he is in D.C. right now, actually, but he arrived yesterday to pay his respects to Jimmy Carter's casket in the Capitol, but also to address the Senate Republican Conference. And what we're learning for the reporting around that is he didn't reach any conclusion about what he thinks the Senate should do in terms of one reconciliation bill covering everything or two. And so we're kind of left now with kind of standing back and standing by, because the Republicans are already in power in the Congress. They could get to work on this right away, and I think to some degree they are, but they still don't have any clear direction of the form it will take or the time line that they should be following.
Okay,
and I think that will be typical for the next 4 years.
Okay. But I want to defend him on this, what he did last night, because he said, one bill or two, I don't care. What he wants is the policies to be enacted.
Right.
And so he wants policies to be enacted, so he is going to leave it to the people who have to pass the bills to figure out the strategy to pass the bills. And that is an improvement over Trump 2016, 2017. Remember, Paul Ryan brought him 2 different innovative ways to get done what he thought he wanted to get done, particularly in relation to Obamacare. And foolishly and needlessly and stupidly, he said, I don't want to do it that way. So as a result, what he wanted to get done was never done, which was, there was this idea about passing killing Obamacare with legislation with a 2-year period in which it would stay in place until a bill could be written to deal with the consequences of replacing Obamacare. And he said, I don't want to do that. I want the replacement instantaneously along with the removal. And then, of course, John McCain and other basically killed the Obamacare.
I got to defend Matt's point here, because what he's pointing to is whether it's one bill or two, no one in Congress knows what Trump's reaction will be if either is a success or a
Fair
failure.
enough.
He's
Okay.
completely unpredictable. And the
Fair enough.
unpredictability is kind of what people want to stop.
Right.
Like, we're sick of having these dramas. Like, people just want things to work again, I think,
Okay.
in
Fair
Congress.
enough. But he is giving Thune and Johnson running room by
Right.
by
To
not by
figure it
not
out.
closing off corridors
Sure,
for
but I'm not sure.
negotiation.
I don't think they know where to run. And I think
Right.
that in the House case, Trump's instinct after being after having conversations with Johnson, with Jason Crow, and with Stephen Miller, said, oh, one bill makes more sense because we have a very narrow margin in the Senate. Rather, we have a narrow margin in the House. And so in order to get everybody in line, it will be easier for me to pressure Freedom Caucus types or even liberal moderate types by saying, look, this one vote, you're really going to vote against stuff on energy and the border because you didn't like what you got on taxes. Come on. To me, that has a lot of logic behind it. But then he talked to Thune, the Senate leader, and Thune was like, well, don't you want to have some legislative wins up early? And then taxes will take longer. And he's like, oh, okay, well, I just want it done. But I think in terms of moving legislation, you do have to have one position and then push it over the finish line. I will just say, too, on the two-bill approach, look, I can understand the argument, as I think Trump does. Yeah, okay, it'd be nice to have the Congress pass a big bill early in the first months of the Trump presidency, maybe before the June recess, right? However, that bill would contain everything that the Republicans agree on. And what happened with Obamacare in 2017? The truth is, Republicans could agree that they wanted to repeal it, but they could not agree on what to replace it with. And that's why you got to the Graham proposal. Well, we'll just kill it, and then we'll have 2 years to make up the legislation. John McCain put an end to that. So then you were left in 2017 with the tax bill, which took a long time to write. They finally passed it in the winter, or right before the beginning of winter, I think in December, and it was very unpopular. And they didn't message it right. So I think, again, do you really want to repeat that? If you get everything that you agree on taken care of, and now all of a sudden you have this huge tax bill, you're going to have to keep the tax cuts. They're the central part of the Republican DNA. But there are a lot of how are you going to include no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime? I just think that this ambivalence could have negative consequences in a few months.
I think, look, you may be right, but all of these questions go to a level of sophistication on the technical aspects of governance that were so absent during the first couple of years of Trump's term because of the amateurishness of the Trump administration and the White House's approach on these issues, that there were all these self-inflicted wounds. And it doesn't really feel. I take your point that he is not giving, particularly House Republicans, the kind of governance that they will need for him to prevail with this one vote majority if every single Democrat decides to vote against the one beautiful bill. And that may not happen, by the way. Like, there are
no, in fact,
Democrats.
I think it makes it more likely that you get some Democrats if you have one beautiful bill.
Right, because they are not going to want to vote against the tax cut. They're not going to want to show, especially if you
against. Sounds like a boy band name. I mean,
yeah, I know. The one beautiful bill.
I liked it when it was one the mega MAGA. Now we've shifted to one beautiful bill.
Right. Anyway, he just again yesterday in his talk at the microphone in the Capitol building after the appearance with the Senate, there's just the music, the Trump music, the way he stands, the way he talks. It's different. When he goes on Truth Social, he's the Trump of social media, right? Gavin Newsom, that stuff. Weird capitalization of letters, like he's Lawrence Sterne, the 18th century novelist. That sort of thing. When he talks, he has a kind of authority that he hasn't felt to me like he has possessed before. easy command, sort of understands the issues, and I think, by the way, will be empowered by this. I told you that California, you were headed for disaster on your fire policy. And I was president of the United States, and I warned Gavin Newsom, and I tried to make a public case for this, and you didn't listen. And the country is now seeing the consequences of not having listened to me. And this gets back to the Nathan Glazer point, which I think very interesting for the second half of this decade, which is here in New York, in California, in Chicago, in these places where there is blue state governance, the incompetence, the inability to allow people to live ordinary day-to-day quotidian lives with a sense of safety and security is going to tell very seriously. And if Washington ends up functioning better with in a better way, that will have knock-on consequences in the blue states, because the idea will be, well, I don't know, these guys seem to know what they're doing, and Karen Bass and Eric Adams and Brandon Johnson and I don't know who else, have no clue, and we can't.
I mean, it would be nice if Trump populism became the gateway drug to a return to sort of more traditional conservative small government. But I mean,
I'm not even talking about small government. I'm talking about effective. Right? That was like, I want to sound like Michael Dukakis, like competent government, like minimally competent government. Like, if there are criminals on subway platforms, you put cops on the platforms and you arrest people before they do things, and then you deal with the consequences later. Anyway, go ahead.
What's interesting to me to look for in regard to Trump and the wildfires specifically is that traditionally when Democrats make a political point in the wake of a natural disaster, the media bolsters their point. When Republicans make valid political points in the wake of a natural disaster, the media pile on the Republican for politicizing the natural disaster. Now, what I think is that that's not going to be effective anymore. It'll be done. If Trump makes the kinds of points you're talking about, John, here, saying I am on record as having been talking about this for a long time, I think the media will come down on him. But I don't think anyone's listening.
I want to talk about the media in the last 48 hours because there's something very telling happened. So I wasn't paying attention to Fox, but I was paying attention to MSNBC and CNN, both Tuesday night when the fires really broke out, and then last night, Wednesday night, as the story, became the major story in the country without question. Tuesday night, I wanted to know what was going on with the fires. So I did what I have done for 40 years. Which is I went to CNN first because Fox sometimes has trouble deploying resources quickly, or, they really are committed to their primetime lineup because they get such high ratings, whatever. And CNN always was the network of, when there's breaking news, you go to CNN first to see what's going on. And I go to CNN, and there is the Abby Phillip show having fights about, Trump talking about Greenland for an hour. And then I go to MSNBC, which at least has the resources of NBC News behind it, and there's Lawrence O'Donnell talking about Greenland. Last night, Anderson Cooper had redeployed to Pacific Palisades, so he was there, and all of that, and had this conversation with Gavin Newsom and whatever. And then at 10 o'clock, Abby Phillip's show comes on, and they have the fire in the lower right hand corner, and Stacey Plaskett, the delegate from the Virgin Islands, starts complaining to Scott Jennings, who was talking about how DEI may have affected the LA fire department, saying, "Hey, black people built the White House, so I don't know what your problem is. Do you have problems with the White House?" Bring this up only to say that Meanwhile, you go on Twitter and there are citizens who are filming everything that is going on in the streets. You see fires, you see people driving down the street, you see anything that you needed to know, you got from X, and you could not get from the mainstream media. This is a big moment. This is a big transitional moment. The mainstream media have failed. This is this biggest story in the country. They were not covering it.
No, I had a similar experience Wednesday morning. I woke up early to appear on the Hugh Hewitt show, and Hugh is in California right now, and so we talked about the fires, and he was giving his audience updates. And after the bit, I turned on the television because I had wanted to do research for this podcast, and I went to CNN like you, and it was a politics show. It was Casey Hunt. They were talking about politics and Trump. Then I went to MSNBC for the beginning of Morning Joe, and it was a segment on how Biden is handing Trump just a beautiful American economy with charts from Stephen Ratner. And so the only network actually that was talking about the fires was Fox News.
Right. I mean, Fox.
And then the new media, right? Of course, X had everything, but it was
so
pretty
Fox
stunning.
Is fine. This is my point. Fox is fine. Fox now has all top 20 news shows in the rate.
Yeah,
Fox
it was
knows what its
pretty
audience
incredible.
wants and delivers it. Yeah.
I mean, now CNN, then you had by the end of the day. I don't know if you guys saw this amazing meme that was circulating. David Muir of ABC and also of the presidential debate had gone out to Los Angeles, and he was, he's very buff. And so he was wearing his emergency jacket, and it really accentuated his biceps. And then apparently he turned, and you could see the clothespins that his staff had attached to the jacket.
Oh my God! Yeah.
Accentuate his
the
physique.
Slimming effect is required during covering a disaster.
Slimming effect, and in this own way, in this comical, comic tragic way, you kind of see the vanity and superciliousness of the mainstream media that we're talking about.
Well, that just reminds me of the greatest single moment in the history of cable news, which was, or maybe it wasn't in cable. I don't know. It was Michelle Kaczynski of NBC and MSNBC.
The canoe.
Yeah, during Hurricane Sandy, and she is in a canoe in New Jersey, and she's saying, I mean, the disaster is unparalleled. And then behind her, two guys are walking
in like 3 inches of water.
The street, because the canoe is in 3 inches of water. And yeah, David Muir and the clothespins is, I think, a very telling indicator that little has changed in the last 12 years since Hurricane Sandy.
As our YouTube viewers know, we don't indulge in such vanity. We would never.
No, it's plain.
This is how we are.
That's right.
Come to you,
exactly. We're very, very plain. Now, I want to make a recommendation, which is not plain at all. I went to see the new version of Nosferatu at the movie theater last night, made by the director Robert Eggers. It's interesting because it was 102 years ago or 103 years ago that the German film Nosferatu, which was basically a ripoff, is a total ripoff of Dracula, which was then under copyright because Bram Stoker had written the novel Dracula 30 years earlier. And the film was actually withdrawn from distribution and was supposed to be destroyed because a court found that it was the original Nosferatu, because it had found that it was a copyright violation, that it was a work of thievery. But like 3 or 4 people saved the film. You can see it; it's an expressionist masterpiece, one of the great works of German expressionism. Incredibly influential F.W. Murnau, the director, sort of helping create modern film language in this movie. And this new movie is sensationally good. Now, I'm going to tell you, A, it's very scary, and B, it's very dirty. So if you don't like or find it hard to deal with sexuality on screen, I do not recommend it. But it manages to cast a kind of expressionistic spell from its first moment to its last. It's very serious. It's very grave. It is set in 1838. in Germany and in Transylvania. And it is a movie that pits the idea of modern science against the world of medieval enchantment, and it proposes that Dracula, or Count Orlok, as he's called here, um, is an undead creature possessed by. He was an enchanter possessed by a demon, and that this is what gives him this power to stay alive, stay undead, and to have this metaphysical control over people at vast distances, including this young woman with whom he has this psychic connection, played by Lily Rose Depp, Johnny Depp's daughter, who looks exactly like her mother, the singer Vanessa Paradis. It is beautiful. It is terrifying. And it is very serious in taking seriously the idea that there are forces beyond our comprehension. It manages to get you into the mind space in which the supernatural is as real as the natural. That is a very difficult thing to pull off. A lot of horror movies that have supernatural elements try to do it, and they can't really pull it off because people don't actually believe in the supernatural. It's not clear to me that Robert Eggers doesn't believe in the existence of the supernatural, and the movie is infected by it and haunted by it. It is some kind of a masterpiece, and I really, really strongly recommend it. Again, with the understanding that if you don't like horror, it's very scary. And because the entire expression of the demonic takeover of the world by Dracula here comes through sexuality. It's quite explicit at certain moments. So that is my recommendation.
I might skip that one. Not a fan of horror, but I am a fan of Eggers's The Northman, which is the greatest John Milius movie John Milius did not make. And so as a Milian, I do like The Northman, and I might watch that again.
Yeah. Well, The Northman, he's made 4 movies. This is his 4th. He's made The Witch, The Lighthouse, The Northman, and now Nosferatu. And what they all have in common, aside from being set in the past, is that they are efforts to portray the pre-modern world, not without judgment, but The Northman is a movie about what it would have been like to be a Viking in the 9th century, and shows them just being meaning they pillage, they rape, they kill each other, they're cannibals, they believe magic exists, and anyway, The Northman is an amazing movie. The Lighthouse is a pretty amazing movie. The Witch is too scary for me, but there's nobody quite like him. No one ever been quite like him, because he is trying to make you live in the 19th century or in the 9th century and sort of feel as though, like a great piece of historical fiction can, like you have somehow journeyed back in time. That's as I say, uniquely difficult thing to do, and he really does pull it off. So that's Nosferatu for me. We'll be back tomorrow. For Matt, Christina Nabop, John Podhoretz, keep the candle burning.